Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's presentation on communication. So we have a lot of things to cover and I'm very excited. But first, let me introduce myself. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Jessica Denise Dixon. Pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a Black woman descended from the enslaved who holds both their pain and trauma and their resilience. I'm a consultant with Rise San Diego, which is who we got to do this contract through. And I was in their 6th leadership cohort as a fellow. So I am excited to be able to be with you all and to lead you in a conversation that I think can be very revolutionary. I run my own coaching and consulting business, and that's really about getting people face to face with their whole humanity and the truth of who our souls were created to be in the world. And I do consulting, helping organizations create cultures of safety where people can really feel self-expressed. And if you've been to a workshop with me before, you know I love to start with some kind of presence practice, just getting us in the moment, in the here, in the now. So you can turn your camera off or you can stay on. You can close your eyes if you'd like, or you can soften your eye gaze and just kind of drop in to this moment. Just being with the stillness where there's nothing to do. In this moment, we practice presence, we practice being connected to our experience, being connected to our bodies, being connected to our hearts, to the fullness of who we are. Breathing in through your nose and out through the mouth. Breathing in. And out. Allowing yourself to be present to this moment, knowing that, you know, whatever you had before is shaping how you are now. The things that are coming afterwards and whatever thoughts, excitement, dread you have about them are shaping how you are now. And that is all welcome. Taking another deep breath in. Oh. Allowing your mind to just do whatever it does, thoughts to come in, come out. No need to get attached. Noticing the sensations in your body. Maybe you notice nothing. Maybe you notice, oh, my body is doing a lot of stuff. Just pausing for a moment and noticing. Breathing into the center of your heart, center of your chest. Being with whatever emotions that you're feeling, whether you're excited or apathetic, or, you know, maybe there's grief, maybe there's anger. Every expression is welcome as part of our full experience as a human. Maybe you want to give yourself a hug or touch, you know, part of your body. Maybe rub your legs a little bit, give yourself a little squeeze. Just reminding ourselves that we have a body. Sometimes when there's overwhelm, we can feel so scattered. And sometimes it's nice to just come back to, here I am, here's my body. We're going to end this time with 3 deep breaths in. Trusting that at the end of the breath, there will be another inhale. And coming back to your natural cadence and rhythm of breath. Allowing yourself to just rejoin the space and whatever that looks like. My check-in question for today is, for you, what are the signs that summer is here? Drop it in the chat. What activities, what music, what foods do you associate with the season? Now, for me, bonfires. It's like bonfire at the beach after a long day, when it gets just a little bit chilly and we're, making s'mores and watching the beautiful sunset. The warm sun, slushies, Rainier cherries. Oh, watermelon sailing. Oh, sunsets. Yes. The crowded beach. It brings me joy. I have a friend who just moved here and she was like, is it always this crowded in the summer? I'm like, yeah, it's the best. Barbecue, sunsets after 8 p.m. OMG, yes, the long days. I love it. Being able to have the windows open when you sleep. Oh, I feel that. That came sooner than I expected. A little sooner than I expected. Oh, happy summer. Happy summer. So, all right, friends, we're going to talk about communication. And one of the things I want to start by saying is that there's not a magical solution to your communication problems. Within your personal life, within your organization, within your professional life, there is not a magical solution. So what I want you to do, I want you to just listen to what I'm offering you. I'm going to offer you support, and know that effective communication is something that takes practice. So if you're looking for a quick fix or a magical solution, I want you to consider where that comes from. Many of us have been conditioned that urgency is best. And it comes from a white supremacist capitalistic paradigm that values urgency and reduces us to efficiency and effectiveness and productivity. But effective communication is how we relate to one another. So maybe you did the pre-work worksheet. I know that Kristen put it in the chat, and you can pull it out. I'm not going to ask anyone to share that, but I want to give you just a moment to think of what are the top, maybe there's 1 or 2 communication issues, concerns, things that you're processing. What's the issue? Who does it involve? You, who else? Now, you might think of it from a work perspective, but of course, this also applies to our personal lives. So just take a moment or 2 and think, because I want you to listen to this presentation with those things in mind. So I'm going to give you just a moment. You don't have to put those in the chat. Okay. Hope everyone has something. And listen with them in mind. So let's talk about communicating despite cultural differences. And if you have been working with me or know me long enough, spoiler alert, we're going to begin the conversation with ourselves. We begin with ourselves so that we don't think that the point is to fix someone else. So we want to start with, what level of awareness do we have about how we come across and who we are? Now, one aspect of that is understanding our own defensiveness when people are communicating with us. So We have to be accountable for our responses. So this means distinguishing between something that might make us uncomfortable and unsafe, and how that might shape when we feel like communication is hostile. Now, white supremacy has conditioned many nervous systems to see uncomfortable and unsafe as the same. The more wealth privilege, the more white privilege, male privilege, or power in a position in an organization, like hierarchical power, we have, the more often we see this. But discomfort, challenges in conversation, things that make us uncomfortable, does not mean that we're unsafe. But we have to be able to own that and see that. So I joke sometimes as a coach, that sometimes we're just like attachment wounds and dysregulated nervous systems that are trying to keep us safe from harm. And while it is a joke, there's actually something to pay attention to there. Our sense of whether we're safe or not actually guides us most of the time, even if only on an unconscious level. Even if we're not always thinking, I feel unsafe, our bodies, our nervous systems are going to guide us to defend ourselves from the sense that we are not. So if we don't know the difference between being uncomfortable and actual threats to our safety, we may be triggered by many things. A few of them, we might be triggered by different ideas, because things that might be innovative might challenge some way that the organization functions or the way that you see yourself at a core level. Another thing might be people who have different cultural norms, because when you're set to uphold your own culture as what's normal, you're often also conditioned to view differences at worst as a threat, but at least as something strange that you might need to pay attention to and watch out for. Another thing is people with different personalities. People who are direct might make you uncomfortable if you are more accustomed to indirect or more passive language. And that doesn't mean passive is better and direct is worse, or direct is better and passive is worse. If you need to explore all the options, or you need to poke holes in everything to make sure that it holds up, that a plan was going to hold up, that could feel like a threat to someone who feels very sure in their plan that it's going to go well. They might feel really challenged by that. That might make communication really hard. So we're most likely to feel the most comfortable with our cultural norms, but it might feel the safest for us to uphold white professionalism culture. And I say this because even for people who aren't white, or who aren't, don't have like dominant privileged identities, it may feel like a threat when another person of color or someone who isn't male behaves out of line with the norms. Because there is a sense with, when you don't hold those dominant identities, of being othered, of being grouped together and othered. So often there's a sense that if they do something, if they're like me and they do something, then I know that there's going to be retribution or punishment for me. And so part of effective communication means that checking in. What are we upholding? What are the things that we sense are going to keep us safe that might actually create challenges in our communication? And do we know when we're safe? We have to pause. We have to check in with ourselves. When new ideas come in, when there's feedback you don't love, when the status quo is being challenged, when there's tension in the conversation, how do you distinguish between feeling unsafe and uncomfortable? And so often when we feel unsafe, we have a stress response. Now, if we have unsafe and uncomfortable conflated with each other, we might also have this response when we feel uncomfortable. And that's why we have to be with ourselves to distinguish these things. So we might have a fight response where there's arguing, a lot of intellectualization, needlessly coming up with pushback, or what about this? What about this? There might be minimizing and dismissing of someone else. There's also a flee response or a flight response where we might literally leave a conversation. Like I've seen people walk out of the room, for example, or leave a Zoom room. We may withdraw our thoughts or energy. Like we just stop participating in the conversation. or we just kind of like check out. We also might freeze, and freeze is a different thing. It's like a sense of like when you're overwhelmed and you feel like speechless, or you get confused, or you feel like things are muddled, or you feel like you're going blank in your head. There's also an appease response. Now, this is where we agree even when we don't. When we go along to get along, where we defer our own desires and our own ideas. And this and the next one often comes when we feel the most powerless. I see this a lot with people of color in white spaces, like just not really being sure. So like, I'm just gonna go along, and because then I know if I fight back, then I'll be the angry person, and that could get violence against me. And there's all of those dynamics. And the next response is collapse. And this is a shutdown response. And so this could literally mean collapse, or it could just mean like brain stops working, body really just slows down as a way of self-protecting from really a dire sense of powerlessness. So we start to practice self-awareness. We start to practice self-awareness around these things. And it's important for us to notice that when we're having a reaction like this, when we're responding like this, it might be a sense that we feel unsafe. So when we feel unsafe, we get to ask ourselves, am I unsafe? Am I actually unsafe? Is this because of a prior experience where I was actually harmed, or where there was a threat of harm? Was it with the person I'm talking to right now, or within this group? And is the threat still present in this moment? If I'm actually safe and there's not an in the moment threat, but I'm uncomfortable, how can I breathe into this moment? How can I pause and expand my capacity to be with discomfort so I can stay present? So much of anti-racism and being able to expand who we know ourselves to be as leaders is being able to increase our capacity to be with things that are uncomfortable. I'm just checking the chat. I see a comment. Sometimes I freeze when I'm being challenged on something I don't feel I'm well versed in. Yeah, I feel like my mind is going a mile a minute trying to process. Yes. I think that is common. This is why the pause becomes so important. It becomes so important because, I don't know about y'all, but sometimes when I feel challenged, I am just like, I'll just try to find whatever logical thing makes the most sense. And sometimes it just isn't my wheelhouse. So sometimes I actually need to pause and say, I don't have that answer. But when I'm defensive and I'm just like going and going and going, like I don't give myself time to pause. So then I end up like kind of making something up. Then I have to go back later and be like, no, sorry about that. I just was just like, I kind of am nervous. Admitting you don't have the answer is hard. It is, but it's also part of our humanity. And I really think that as we look at anti-racist practice, which of course is like why what we're talking about, right? There is very much we have to dismantle our thoughts and our ideals about expertise. And we have to be able to see, oh, me not having the answer is not a character flaw. It doesn't mean I'm not a very competent professional, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, admitting what we know and letting go and knowing that we're not the expert in what we don't know. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment. So if you hold an identity that has power or privilege, and this might mean a social identity or in the hierarchy of your organization, you may experience the defenses that I mentioned from people who don't have the same power or privilege. And it's important to actually notice and be aware of how power dynamics shape these. So hierarchy and the way that you wield power in your position may create a dynamic that doesn't feel safe for people. So if you're holding this position of power, it's important for you to be responsible and accountable for that. If you're in a position that holds power, it's your responsibility to check in around your own defensiveness and to be responsible for where others may feel unsafe or defensive, because that is what leadership is. That is what leadership is. So another thing in this category of like, who are we, is to understand ourselves. And it's having what's called cultural humility. Now, if you were not at a previous workshop, or I think it was maybe the pre-work, there was a workbook. I'm going to share it with you. It's like the Who Am I workbook. And it's really helpful to understand this idea of cultural humility. Give me 1 second. All right, it is in the chat for you. And there's not enough time to do that, that workbook right now. But it's important work, because this workbook gives us insight into who we are and how we've been shaped. I'm going to try my tea for the first time. Oh, it's good. So, let's see. Oh, I see something in the chat. Is freeze also procrastination, or maybe just part of it? Not necessarily. It's not necessarily, but it could be. Procrastination sometimes comes from a perfectionism that, you know, is just part of culture. So it could be that I'm not sure what to do, so I shut down and just put it off until later. It could be a part of a freeze, but it's also not necessarily. So that's a good question for you to check in around. Like, what is the drive of my procrastination? Is it because I'm like overwhelmed and can't handle it, and then I'm like, I'll deal with that later? Or is it like, I'm in my perfectionism right now and it's not looking perfect enough, and so I'm going to put it off? And yeah, so good question. Thank you. So cultural humility, I feel like my speech impediment doesn't like cultural humility. I have to slow down. Is a concept that was termed in the medical field to actually help doctors support their patients. And cultural humility is a process that lasts a lifetime. So it's where you explore your own identity, the cultures that are part of your identity, the intersections of your identity that make you who you are, which that workbook is going to be supportive of if you haven't done it. To be conscious of the power and privilege that you hold and the ways that you uphold forms of supremacy, whether male supremacy through patriarchy, wealth supremacy, white supremacy, etc., able-bodied supremacy. It's also a process of choosing to learn about other cultures and the ways that their differences bump up against your differences. And I feel like I was gonna say like your norms, but you know, every person has different norms. And so your norms aren't the norm. Isn't that paradoxical? Culture is important because it's the lens through which we see ourselves in the world. It's our attitudes, norms, values, beliefs, opinions, behavior, what's acceptable, what's not. It also means that it's what we use to judge others. It's the standards that we have for ourselves and others. So it's actually like only pride to believe that we can be neutral. Neutrality, objectivity denies our ancestors and how they've shaped us. It denies that our communities have had a part in shaping us. It denies anyone that we've learned from. It denies that prior experiences and traumas have shaped us. Cultural humility allows us all to lay down the sense that we have to know it all. And this is especially important if you hold power and privilege. To acknowledge that you know what you do know, that there are things that you have expertise in, but that doesn't mean that you know everything. To acknowledge that you don't know what you don't know is beautiful. It's a beautiful thing because it makes you more human. To be open and willing and intentional to presence yourself to all the things that there are for you to learn is just part of being human. To choose humility and being related to people who don't have power in your organizations, or because they are part of groups that have been historically oppressed and marginalized. to know and understand and value that lived experience is a form of expertise. Often expertise is seen as who has the certificate, who has gone through the training, who has the degrees. But lived experience is a valid form of expertise. Now, this humility also applies to generational differences, which impacts different ways of communicating, the language that we use, how formal we are versus informal, the different ways that we relate to one another, whether we prefer email or text, or like a quick message in a Slack versus like picking up the phone call. It impacts slang that we use, different expectations of what the work world should look like whether you should stay at a company for decades or, there's, millennials, are just like judged for moving to different companies, for upward mobility. There's also sometimes it can be a generational thing also to prefer in person, like we can't do this remote thing. We're going back to in person. Sometimes there's a sense that people who are doing remote work are lazy. And that can be from this older, hard work generational thing. Or maybe you prefer remote work because you enjoy the flexibility of productivity, but you're in your own time, which is a value that many people in the younger generations have. Not working just to work, but working to actually enjoy life. And this is a big difference. This is a big difference in generations. Now, many of these things are unconscious and unspoken. They are just the way things are. So it's important that we do the work, our own personal work, to see what is it for me that's true? What is it for me that I'm holding? Because it's easy to judge the other, the ones that we other as too different, too complicated, whatever. But when we reduce someone else, we reduce ourselves. The thing is that we all have biases, and the point isn't to get to some kind of unbiased ideal, because that is impossible. It's impossible. The point is to be able to check in with ourselves and around our preferences and see, like, where did these preferences come from? Where did these judgments come from? Who did I learn this from? Was it my first boss? Was it my first job? Was it growing up with immigrant parents? What are the things that have shaped these ideas and these ideals about what our work world looks like? So as we practice cultural humility, one of the most important things that we get to do is to check in, to pause, to give space, to check in with others, to make sure that we are on the same page, to make sure that we aren't just like going off what we believe is true because of our perspective and negating other very valid and important perspectives. So we give space for processing instead of forcing people to move on. I acknowledge that when I come and do workshops like this, for example, you all are getting a lot of information. It's very fast. And some of you are going to say, I can see immediately what needs to change. And some of you, it's going to take, the next 3 months for you to fully integrate it. And there's not a right or wrong. We all have different ways of interacting with information and showing up in the world, all that are very valid. So giving space can be very beautiful and very important. And, as we practice cultural humility, we expand our leadership because we can become more adaptable. And we remember that we don't have to like the way someone else is related to something or what they believe about something to be able to honor them and their perspective is valid. Now, this brings me to the topic of microaggressions, because I feel like we can't really talk about cultural humility without talking about microaggressions. Because the less you practice cultural humility, the more likely you are to be the perpetuator of these, or for the culture of the organization to have a lot of these. Now, they're defined, and some people are like, those you're defined like they're not mine. None of this is micro. And I would agree, but it's just the name of it. So that's okay. Now they're defined as commonplace, verbal, or behavioral indignities, slights, and insults between those of different races, genders, cultures, etc. Now, they can be intentional or from a place of unconscious bias, and they create a hostile environment. Now, they come in a few forms. The first is micro assaults. Now, these are intentional and deliberate slights and insults that are meant to hurt. Some examples, profiling people who might come into your spaces who appear homeless, being suspicious of people of color, or people of a certain age group, young people, maybe teenagers. It's also like using blatantly racist, sexist, classist language. And often this is played out like a joke, or it's just like what's normal. Of course, it's not funny. But another form is micro invalidations. Now, these can be more subtle, but they demean, they discredit, they minimize a person and people groups. And these micro invalidations work to exclude or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or opinions of someone. Now, these are things like, I don't see color, that color blindness that was really popular before, but people have clung to, even though, it's been very, very clearly stated that that's a form of erasure. Another one is, oh, I didn't know people like you would know this. Another is constantly misgendering someone, even after they have corrected you. Another is just, being told you're too sensitive, if you've ever gotten that feedback. No, you're human. We all have different levels of sensitivity. There's no such thing. How could anyone outside of you judge what that is? Another form is a micro insult, and this is disrespect. It's just blatant disrespect. They may seem more subtle, but here's why, because they're not subtle. But when you're in survival mode in spaces that hurt you, you can turn yourself off from tracking them out of self-protection. So these micro insults might be like, speaking, if you're doing hiring, speaking about the most qualified person for the job, the implications of that really meaning a white male, telling a Black woman that they're so articulate, saying to someone, oh, you don't look like a girl, who uses she, her pronouns. So when we're not practicing cultural humility, we are much more likely to do these things. So we actually have to develop a culture of humility. And we do that through trainings. This is like a framework for you to implement within your organizations. It's doing trainings, actively integrating this learning into the work experience. So I want you to kind of look back at the top concerns that you brought in. And I want you to take a moment or two. I'm going to give you probably like a minute and a half, not a long time, to write down what you might be able to utilize more self-awareness around. Like, where might you need more self-awareness? What might be your own cultural barriers to explore? And what might need to be addressed with people outside of you? So I'm going to just set a quick timer. You don't have to put it in the chat, but if there's something that comes up, feel free to. I'm just going to pause to reflect for a moment. Okay, friends, we're gonna keep rocking and rolling. So taking accountability for our own bias and the way that we show up is worthy work. It is worthy work. Now, it gives us a foundation for more honest and open communication. And one of the most important things that I believe that it's important to create and curate within our organizations is a culture of curiosity and to develop that within ourselves. Now, I often find that many people don't know the difference between curious questions and judgmental questions, or the difference between sharing and giving advice. So it's important that we actually create these distinctions. These distinctions we need both in the ways that we ask and even in receiving. Because if someone's asking a curious question, but you are defensive and you feel judged, that's going to shape things. It's going to really shape things. So judgment is an examination to form an opinion about something or to make a diagnosis of something. Curiosity is an open-hearted inquisitiveness. It's not to prove anything right or wrong. It's a seeking of information. So, do you know the difference within yourself? And can you slow down and check in with yourself to see what that difference is? And, we want to start to be able to check in with ourselves and say like, oh, I thought I was being curious, but that question came from this other judgment that I had. Now, judgment isn't always bad, but it is an assessment of things. It's like the value that we have around things or how we hold things, what we believe about things. So is going to color our questions when we ask, from a place of judgment. And how often, many of us have never really had the space to ask truly curious questions. In our culture, we often feel judged because this culture doesn't value just asking questions for question's sake. We're used to questions meaning something about our legitimacy. And that's not necessarily so. So do we have this way of being able to distinguish those things within us? I'm gonna check the chat real fast. Yeah. Great. Yeah, thank you. Okay. One of the things that I'm personally committed to in my work is to help people and organizations develop cultures that are mutually consensual. And what I mean when I say that is that within the relationships in your workplace, at home, that there is an active co-creation. That I take responsibility for creating safety for you and you take responsibility for creating safety for me. Now, of course, to do this would imply that there is mutual care and respect. Even if we're working toward different goals, that there is at least a foundation of that, but I think it's crucial. And why am I saying all this? Because the practice of curiosity is a big part of creating safety for one another and improving our communication. One of the biggest things that can be a hindrance of healthy communication and healthy relationships within an organization and outside of it is unsolicited feedback, even in the form of a question. Now, this happens a lot. Well, have you considered X? Have you considered this? And people, might think that they're being curious, but they really just gave advice. They had a thought about something and then they communicated it. But, sometimes questions are the polite or nice way of doing things. We can't blatantly say like, yo, your idea sucks, bro. So we say, oh, have you thought about this? Now, we've talked a lot about power dynamics, right, already. And it's because they are important. The power that you have by the virtue of the role that you're in, as well as the power that you have based on privilege, based on your identity, can shape whether or not people have the sense that they can be who they are and say what needs to be said. Now, I first realized that I needed boundaries around unsolicited feedback and advice when I started doing some of my deeper personal growth work, because I realized my heart was so guarded for so long. And I realized that I didn't want to feel like I had to protect myself all the time. And I don't have to protect myself when someone says, I have feedback for you. Are you open to that? Is right now the best way to share? Is right now the best time? It becomes increasingly easier for me to interact with someone who has that care for me, who's not just telling me what to do. Even if it's like a good idea or wise or kind, it makes me shut down my heart. So, you know, a sense of safety guiding our communication is really important. First, it comes in this self-awareness, and then it also comes from this, you know, curiosity and mutual consent. Now, if you've ever been given advice that you did not ask for, I want you to take a minute and remember the way it made you feel. Put it in the chat if you remember. Just pause just for a second. I'm sure each of us have had this experience. Annoyed, eye roll. Yes. What else? What are some other questioning? If I didn't understand. Yes, questioning yourself. Oh my gosh, that's a good one. Yes, got some the other day, laughed it off. Yes, I love that. You have that pride for yourself. That is absolutely the way to be. Absolutely the way to be. Any other reflections? I love this. I know personally for me, it's made me feel like I've done something wrong, like I need to defend myself, and makes me feel ashamed. Or like, bruh, you don't know better than me. I'll often feel that one as well. You find it hard to not perpetuate the model minority myth. Oh yeah, yes, Enneagram 8. Whoop, whoop. Very, very real. Not perpetuating the model minority myth. That's really important, right? There's something called a stereotype threat, where, you know, people who, you know, stereotypes are obviously, you know, created and perpetuated by the people who have the most power. And for those of us who don't have those identities, we're always dodging stereotypes, and we're doing whatever we can to not perpetuate them. And it can be like a real hard, it can be a conundrum, you know, to figure out like how to show up authentically in a space, but also not be the myth or not be the stereotype. So it's important that we practice consent and curiosity. So consent can be a buzzword, but consent means that you check in with the person and that you wait for a yes. It's simple. I'm not saying it's easy in a culture that historically has said, like, I have power over, and therefore I don't have to consider your needs. There's no penalty for a no. And there's not a demand or manipulation to get them to a yes. Now, I was recounting a boundary setting conversation. Oh, yes. So the question in the chat was, can you give an example of consent versus curiosity? So they play together. Consent and curiosity play together. They are not separates. So we can talk a little bit. I have some examples coming up as well. So yeah, I was talking to someone about a boundary setting conversation with my mom. And because I'm like, hey, I don't like your unsolicited advice. And she's like, but I'm your mom. Yes, I do know that. I do know who I'm speaking to, but I also don't really like it. And we talked about why, and we've had a few conversations. So I was recounting that conversation with someone else, and they were like, how do you know what to say? And my answer is that I don't know what to say. But here's the thing that I want you to consider regarding communication. We always want to be thoughtful about a few things. What do I need? What do I want? What do I see that the problem actually is? And how can I be thoughtful about communicating in a way that honors myself and doesn't dishonor or dehumanize someone else? because that person needs the space to be thoughtful about what they want and what they need and what they see as the problem as well. So when we're communicating and, we have feedback to give someone, we get to ask ourselves and the other person these questions, and it's a few of them. What's the best setting to have this conversation? Is this the best timing? And I'm not saying the most ideal, because if we wait for an ideal, again, it will never happen. Our ideals they're aspirational, but they're unreachable. Another question, what do I need to keep my heart open and not go into defensiveness? So that might mean like, I need enough sleep. I know that if I have this conversation before coffee, I will cuss someone out. That if I'm in like stuffy work clothes, that's not going to work. I need to be comfortable. That I need downtime before or after big meetings. So what do I need to keep my heart open, and asking them what they need? And can they give themselves what they need? There might actually be a request of us as well. It might be a request that we have a phone conversation, that we don't raise our voices, that we whatever. Because, culturally, some cultures just tend to get more excited. Just get more excited and get really loud, and and it's not necessarily a threat, but if that's what you need, being able to request that becomes important. If someone raising their voice becomes a situation where you feel like you are going to shut down, you're either going to go into a freeze or appease or flight response, you're going to want to make sure that you have that request, that you make that request. Another question, what do I need to be intentional about regarding my body language so it stays open and receptive? Now, I remember doing work around this a few years ago where I was like, had my arms crossed, and someone was talking to me, and I was just like, and she's like, what's up with this body language? I'm like, I'm listening to what you're saying, and she's like, why don't you uncross your arms and open up a little bit? And what it did was it changed the whole conversation, because our body language is communicating something subtly, even if we don't realize it. So it's important for us to, I sometimes, if I'm having a hard conversation, I'll make sure that I have a chair with the back. I'll sit back, like kind of try to pin my shoulders back and keep my arms on the armrest. And that's a way for me to stay open, keep my feet flat on the ground. And I kind of just like open my legs a little bit, just give myself some space. So, intentional body language. Another question, is my request actually a request, or is it an ultimatum or a demand? So, now, if you're thinking there's not enough time to do all of this, like when are we gonna, like if we need to deal with something, we just like need to deal with something. I want to say that that's really normal, that this conversation is about shifting culture. And when as we practice these things, it gives us an opportunity to do a few things. One is dismantle hierarchy, because everyone gets to say and how they're being related to, and power over doesn't run the show, right? Like, it doesn't matter if you're a supervisor, you can still ask the people that you're supervising when the best time to give them feedback is. That's actually just a way of honoring and respecting them as humans, like honoring their full humanity. It rewires power dynamics and allows for the inner agency of every person in the organization and their own empowerment to arise. Now, when power is seen as scarce, you'll find power over and power hoarding. With a culture of consent, it allows for power with creative, imaginative, collective, prophetic power with one another, where we're together. Power hoarding sets limits where they do not need to exist. And it's all for the benefit of people who have the power. Now, this also shifts the need to be seen as an expert and for paternalism, because we can be with ourselves. The person that we're talking to can be with themselves. We don't have to assume an expert position or assume that we know what's best for anyone, or we know what's best for a situation. We don't even have to know what's best for ourselves, because in a culture like this, it's co-created. We might not have any ideas, and someone might have something to offer us. And then we implement it together. Another opportunity is to dismantle individualism, letting go of this illusion of separation, embracing more interdependence and interconnectedness. We're not solely responsible for our safety. And we don't have to be the ones like with expertise that like sit in towers overlooking others. And another thing is just increasing our capacity to be with discomfort and conflict expands. When we start to see conflict as a normal part of relating with one another, rather than the sense that something is wrong, it just automatically makes our leadership that much stronger. Because people can be safe saying things that are dissenting. So distinguishing between curiosity and judgment allows us to be present with ourselves and others in a new way. It gives us the ability to pause and check in with ourselves. So here's a few things that we can maybe say that might just be helpful for you. Because, implementing the language of it can be the thing that seems overwhelming. Like, how do I apply this? So we can say things like, I had some thoughts I think could help you. Are you open to hearing them right now? Do you want feedback or reflection or a suggestion right now? Or do you just want to be witnessed? I know you didn't ask, but may I offer some unsolicited feedback on X? Or, ooh, I had an idea that I'd like to share. Is now a good time for that? When would a good time for that be? Simple, may I share reflection? And as we're working through distinguishing between curiosity and judgment, we can ask like, I feel curious, but this might actually be advice, but can I talk it out? And we can course correct as I'm figuring it out. Some of us are verbal processors. Some of us are going to be a lot easy. It's going to be easier to practice this in our mind and then say it. For some of us, it's going to be a matter of verbally processing and then being like, hey, I just gave advice. I take it back. I take it back. That was my bad. That was my bad. I got out of sorts. So we have to, be able to apologize and just move on. And remembering that this is about a clear yes, and that no is a sufficient answer. Now, if there's a timeline or deadline, you're working on a project, you're working with your supervisee, for example, it's appropriate to follow up on when a good time would be, even if no is not the right one, honoring that it is important. But when we give people space, often, sometimes I'm like, no, I don't want to hear anything that you have to say. And sometimes I'm like, sure. Can I cut you off if it gets too overwhelming? And can we push the pause on it if it gets too overwhelming for me? So sometimes, those are things that I ask. Oh, yes, this is a great comment in the chat. Thinking of the consent and curiosity behind some really normalized statements in the workplace, like, can I pick your brain? That can be extractive. Yes. Can you really say no to that? Like, probably not. Let's be real. Let's be real. So that is great. Yes, thank you for that. That was a great addition. Now, one of the things that's really important for me to say is that if there is harm happening, this consent stuff goes out the window. Like I want to be really, really clear that if there's immediate harm, speaking immediately and giving that feedback is important. It's important, but it also doesn't have to be done in like a dehumanizing way. So I have a worksheet on that I really like. I didn't create it, and it's very much cited. So you can find more information there, but it's on calling out versus calling in, which are two very valid ways of communicating. Now, if there's immediate harm, calling out can be really, really important. Things like saying, no, I need you to stop right now, or that was hurtful and I need you to know how your comment landed. So immediate harm does not mean that we wait and say like, oh, I have feet. No, nope, we don't have to wait, because it's always about the safety of someone first. And as we're creating environments of safety and mutual consent, we'll start to see, these things a lot clearer. And one of the things that we need to deal with in this conversation is our relationship to blame. Now, defining blame, it's to find fault with, to rebuke, to condemn. There's a sense of disapproval. Blame often leads us to a sense of shame, and that often turns us into a young part of ourself, our 6-year-old self, our 16-year-old self, our new professional self who didn't know any better. So we have to have the self, and then are you noticing a theme of self-awareness? That we have to be able to notice whose voice is the echo of blame when we feel it. Now, it might be the person in front of us. They might actually be blaming us. Or there may be a sense, because we don't have the capacity to take in feedback, there might be the sense that we are being blamed or judged in some way, which might cause us to be defensive. And often we shrink back to these younger selves where we did something wrong, or we didn't do something wrong, but we were punished and it stuck in our system. So we have to be able to do that work. We may be in cultures, your organization may be a culture, you may have grown up in a culture where blame was normal. Blame causes people to shrink. And so we want to shift that very intentionally through the practice and praxis of curiosity. And so the last aspect of communicating well that I'm going to talk about, and we're almost done, I know it's a lot of information, is developing cultures that repair harm, that values the reparation of harm. I have an apology framework that I'm going to share with you very quickly. And it's based off an acronym that I created, and it's RAMP, RAAMP. And you all will get like these worksheets and everything. I'll send them to Kristen afterwards. So don't worry, you will get it at least by the next week. So the R is reflect on what's happened. What were the events? Who was hurt? What was damaged? The first A, accept responsibility, express regret, say you're sorry. The second A, acknowledge impact, including asking them what was missed. The M is make restitution, to figure out what action needs to happen to make things right. It might be something you do, don't do, something you replace, something you pay for. And then the P is promise, to make your commitment about who you're going to be, and then to take the actions that reflect that. So the first R is reflecting on what happened. This is where you review what happened. What went wrong? What was said? What was done? Who was hurt? What were they hurt by? What are the historical and present contexts that matter in the situation? What power dynamics are at play? The first A, accept responsibility. Here's where we express regret. We say, I'm sorry. We accept responsibility. We say, I was wrong. I messed up. I should not have done X. So what are the ways that you messed up? What's the damage? That's what we focus on with that accepting responsibility. The second A is acknowledging impact. Now, this is some of the more nitty-gritty stuff around apologizing, because I've seen some incomplete, I was going to say something else. I've seen some incomplete apologies. And I think we really have to be thinking about what we're missing in an apology. Acknowledging the impact often is missed. So the impact, I realized that when I did this, I alienated you and I made you feel like you don't belong. I realized that I objectified you and I made you feel othered. And that's a problem, because that's not what I'm committed to. It's what you did and the impact of it. Impact, impact, impact. Now it takes something to actually look at the impact of what you've done. It takes intentionality. It takes integrity. It takes acknowledging and owning your own full humanity, instead of doubling down on all the ways that you're just trying to protect yourself. When we're living as fully human, we can have the boldness to actually check in and say, like, what have I missed? What other impact is there that I didn't see? What didn't I pick up on? I really want to hear it. Often what I've seen with people who are in power is there's apologies out of reactivity, out of shame, out of fragility, out of defensiveness, and they can demand to know what they did wrong. And it feels violent. It feels offensive. And this is a different kind of question because you're starting with self-reflection. You're starting with empathy to say like, whoa, I need to take a step back. I need to breathe into this. I need to recognize that the thing that I did actually hurt someone. You're not asking them to do the work for you. You're asking them to fill you in on what you may have missed. Because there's no way that you can get everything because you're not in another person's head. You don't know their trauma. You don't know the last boss that they had was super demeaning in that way, in a way that you didn't know that. So you get to step back and let them tell you. As part of your cultural humility, educate yourself on what the Black experiences in the world. Read Black women, listen to Black women, believe Black women, listen to the Indigenous experience, the experiences of trans and non-binary people, of people with disabilities, of those with the most marginalized identities. It's an important thing. So you learn and you get clear. You can say, oh, this is what I'm imagining is your experience of that because of the power that I hold in this position. I'm imagining this is the impact. Is that right? Have I missed anything? And another thing that's really important is that they get to say, I don't want to tell you, I don't want to have this conversation. Again, because this is about consent. The person who is harmed gets to decide how to have the conversation because they might not feel safe. They may not feel safe to have that conversation right now, at least. In the moment, they might not feel it. They may feel it later, but giving people space to say, I'm not interested in that right now. Is it really important? Really, really important. Yeah, and impact versus intent. Yes, a very important thing. And then they also may say what there is to say. This is what you missed. And then you say thank you until they're done. And you listen. You allow yourself to take it in. And you allow yourself, no matter how frustrating it is or how misunderstood you feel, to just be with it. It's okay that you are misunderstood. It's fine. If someone is in pain, better to be misunderstood than actually hurt by it. So your internal experience does matter, but now is the time to just get their world. It matters to you, but in this conversation, it's not the focus. And, it's important that if the person that you're repairing your relationship with, if they ask about you and how you're doing in your experience, to redirect the conversation. If you are the person with power, part of power dynamics is that people who don't have power cater to the people who do. So they may want to take their, everything off themselves and put it back on you because that's what we're conditioned to do. And you can say, thank you for asking. I'm happy to talk about that later, but right now it's a distraction and I want to focus on you. And so after they've shared the impacts, you can own responsibility for them. I did X. The impact was X, Y, Z, and I am sorry. I regret not only that I did it, but I regret the harm that it caused you. So next is the M, making restitution, which is another courageous act, is asking, what are the things that I can do to repair and heal the harm? It might be, if you're a supervisor, it might be that to give them space, to give them time off. It might be boundaries around how you communicate. So it's like, what is the thing that I'm going to do? It might be that someone overheard a conversation and you need to apologize to them. So this is where you get clear on what it means to make up for the thing. Again, opening the floor for them to speak, but also if they're not ready, giving them time. Repair can be brief and simple, and it can be long and complex. And it depends on the amount of harm not just between individuals, but also within the context of an institution and within an organization. It depends on what the people need, what the organization needs, what the relationship needs. Now, a note about restitution, making restitution, is that it doesn't have to be like a straightaway agreement. You have to be actually honest about the capacity of what you can do. You know, if someone's asking for an $8,000 professional development experience, but you don't have the funds, you know, maybe you can brainstorm some other things, but you don't want a shame or guilt response to get you to agree with something that you'll ultimately resent or cannot fulfill on. So give yourself time to pause, step away from the conversation, and figure out what actually you can do. Because the next step is P, the promise. This is the commitment. This is the declaration of who you're committed to being, what you're committed to doing. This includes the actions that will rectify the situation. What will be in alignment with who you say you are, what you say you're committed to. So that is it. So everyone take a nice deep breath for me. We talked about a few things. And it can be a lot. I think this is now a good time to pause and to go into questions and reflections. All right, I just want to wrap up by reminding each of us, everyone that is listening, that this is a process that takes time, that takes embodiment, that takes intentionality, and that each person plays a part. If you hold a position of power, you're up in the hierarchy in your organization, you have the accountability and responsibility for creating a culture of safety, so that people can communicate open and honestly and vulnerably with you. If you don't hold positional power, you have the responsibility of actually tapping into your inner power. That's there, it's already there. And so how can you tap into it in small ways now so that you feel like you are empowered to move forward? So a new kind of world, a new way of being with each other, where there's a place where we can create so much safety in our communication, where we can cultivate cultural humility and, you know, be experts in what we are experts in, and lay down the need to be seen as experts where we are not. And this is the way forward. So shaping culture takes time and intentionality, and it is worth it for each of us. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you soon.